if you look at war is a conflict arising from the fear that there will not be enough resources to go around unless we eliminate another culture or person. And what we fear if there aren't enough resources are experiences like hunger, tiredness, physical pain, losing the people we love. And what humanity is willing to do in order to avoid experiencing those situations is cause an equal or greater amount of damage to someone else. For as long as we see one another as separate and see ourselves as better than others or others as better than ourselves, we will continue to perpetuate this cycle. Human beings all have bodies which die at the end of the day. So no matter what happens resource-wise, you are going to physically perish. So what you create psychologically and emotionally, and the ripple effects of those actions, will persist beyond the time of your death. When you create a cultural shift towards greed, for example, then what happens is you're teaching people who are going to follow on from you, the next generation, that greed is the best way to approach life by default. And so the psyche is a collective kind of organism. Your mind and the way it works isn't completely original. It's all based on what you've seen and been exposed to. Your spirit is not. Your spirit is original. It is connected to everything, and yet it is completely original, because the spirit is kind of the space of being but not knowing. Your being is original, your body's original. There isn't another one like it. And when you unknow what you think you know, then you can experience life and presence through that body, which is original. So we've got all these psychological imprints going around. Psycho-emotional imprints, like, generations of feeling victimized, for example. And that creates an oscillation. So generations of feeling victimized, eventually there's a sense of powerlessness, and there becomes a craving for power. Often the victimized culture then comes to power, eventually. And as they come to power, they become the tyrant. The tyrant is just the victim given enough time. And the tyrant then becomes the victim again given enough time. And this is how history rolls, like a wave. There's a wave. Happiness, given enough time, becomes sadness. Happiness is only relative to sadness. If you're happy, it's because you were sad or you will be sad. And right now you feel like you're on a high, not a low. Or you feel happy in the sense of pride when you feel that you're better than who you were, or better than someone else. So the wave isn't just relative to you, it's relative to the people around you. If you see a lot of other people who are sad and you know that you're not, that can be enough to make you happy. But if you're really connected to those people, if there's empathy, then you will feel sad. The point is, there's all these waves. When we look at these waves now at face value in the present and we think about them, we often get flabbergasted. We're like, how can there be this great war? How can there be this? How can humans do this? It's just human nature, isn't it? It's not the full story. It's not the full truth. a better question to ask, other than why is this happening? How could this happen? Is like, literally how? Under what conditions does the victim become the tyrant? Under what conditions is one culture capable of wanting to annihilate another culture? Under what conditions does an infant, a human infant, become a serial killer? And under what conditions does someone become a healer? Under what conditions does someone become capable of tremendous forgiveness? These are good questions to ask because they start to link causality, chains of causality. In order for someone to need to be a tyrant, there must still be a sense of psychological powerlessness or victimhood. Otherwise, there would be no interest, no charge, no positive to the negative. There would be no impulse for that movement and that change to happen. So, what's the solution if serial killers are infants who go through certain conditions of feeling so powerless, that their only way to be close to another human is to revolt into power and to devour, to consume, to kill, to take someone else's life? Feels powerful, doesn't it? To take someone's life is to be lifeless and to try to gain life by taking, except that all of your taking only further reinforces the fact that you were so lifeless and so powerless, and so you become the embodiment of death, which is the opposite of life. So if we understand this, then the solution is not to see the perpetrator as this terrible being and to pity the victim, even if it seems like that's the reasonable way to look at it, even if it seems obvious. Things often are not as they seem. Practically speaking, we help the victim by throwing a lifeline, by throwing a life jacket. Practically speaking, we stop the killer in his tracks. Practically speaking. But it's very important that we also meditate on the opposite, that we recognize that all of these things operate in waves, and if we want peace, we need to recognize the opposite of whatever state we're in. When I am a victim, I need to be careful of adopting the victim mindset and pitying myself, because that pity and sense of powerlessness that comes with the implication of having nothing, no agency, can turn me into a tyrant. So we should pity the tyrant. We should pity the tyrant. And we should look at the victim and think, oh, wow, where you're at is a powerful place, because from victimhood, often big volatile things then result later on down the track, okay? So we need to level out these volatile waves rather than indulging in what we see at face value. We need to look at the patterns and the causes. What this leads to is things coming back to the psycho-emotional. So yeah, we have physical problems, but we're all going to physically perish. And so the ripple effect is the psycho-emotional or relationship pattern that we pass down. How we relate to one another is what we ultimately leave as our legacy. We don't leave anything physical. We're not remembered for who we are. We're not remembered for our name or anything about us as an individual, given enough time. But what will persist are patterns of relating. Because patterns of relating are almost mathematical. They're almost mathematical. It's closer to physics than anything else. Reactions which occur through our biochemistry, through our brain. So the solution is to gain capacity. The solution is to gain capacity and to own what you can own, which is that you are not just your body, you are not just your psyche, you are not just your emotions, and to find ways to support yourself to have that realization, to equip yourself with the internal resources, the internal capacity to expand your consciousness enough to realize that is true, and then to do your best to remain in connection with the world without losing sight of that truth. That's the hard part. So a lot of people, they kind of get this, they kind of get it intellectually, but when it comes to operating in the world, they then abandon that truth. They forget, like there's a lot of people who've experienced states of unity, states of connection, oneness in meditation or after a yoga class, but then they forget. Why do they forget? Because they don't know how to interact with all of the reflections of fear and all of the reflections of how a human can be and still maintain that degree of openness, receptiveness, awareness, and internal resourcefulness. As soon as the yogi comes down from the cave and steps into society, well, that's when the work starts, right? So a lot of people don't want to contribute to society because they feel that it is a runaway train, an inversion, which it often sort of is. But when you can relate to all of the things reflected and projected and maintain a sense of this is ours, this is the paint on the canvas, but this isn't us. This is mine to deal with or to not deal with, to own or to disown, but it is not me. Then you start to experience the stimulus response space. The space is the present, and your perception of a present which isn't completely overrun by reactivity and enmeshment in the psychology and the emotion and the current sensation, that space of presence where you can respond, where you can choose. I choose who I am. I choose how I am. That choice space exists in a mysterious place we call the nervous system. Rumi, the Sufi poet, would call that mysterious space that we call the nervous system the field beyond right doing and wrong doing. Ramana Maharshi, speaking about how we should treat others, says there are no others. The nervous system is the bridge. It is where duality collapses. The nervous system is the fundamental system that runs the human, helps you move in the world, sense the world, feel the world, perceive the world. It is the place where consciousness and world come together. It's the bridge between mind and body, between inside and outside, between self and other. And so it's by working with the nervous system, as well as seeing the cause and effect patterns of how the psyche and the emotions and relational patterns pass through generations, that we begin to release this volatile wave, and we begin to embody and therefore model and therefore become the change that we would love to afford the world. We can't make the world change, we can't make others change, but we can afford the world the opportunity to change when and only when we remain within the throne of our own being, thereby regulated in our nervous system, thereby present with what is in the room, present with what is here that I can interact with. Presence to memories, presence to thoughts about value and good and bad. Presence to that means absence and dissociation to this. What is silent, what is emerging, what you can breathe in that is where your presence belongs, because that is the only place where prediction and fearful, trauma-based reactivity does not need to rear its head. That is the only psychologically and emotionally safe place. Maybe it's physically dangerous, but it's psychologically and emotionally safe. So in that space, traumatic patterns do not need to rear their heads, because there's nothing psychologically or emotionally to protect against. There is no further karmic imprint. There's no further tangling. There's no further enmeshment. There's no self-abandonment. There's no devouring of the other. There's no fragmentation. It's just the physical reality of the moment, which is a lot more like the Garden of Eden, or the way that animals exist in the world. Now let's go into the Garden of Eden and the animal thing, right? So there can be a physical event, like a lion can eat a gazelle, and there's a lot going on there, right? There's a lot going on there. The gazelle's getting fucking eaten. It doesn't want to get eaten. But it's just the jungle. It's just the jungle. For us humans, we have this self-awareness which divides good from bad and right from wrong. So we judge things. The lion and the gazelle, they don't judge things, but they do have preferences. They want to, biologically, the instinct comes from the body. It's not a moral thing. It's not a thought. It's an instinct from the body. I eat, I hunt you, I run away, whatever, hopefully don't get eaten, but it's an instinct. There's no questioning, there's no judgment, there's no entanglement, there's no psycho-emotional gray area. So the animal almost exists in Eden, except that we're a little bit different from an animal. We have self-awareness, but the self-awareness we have is judgmental. Now, the whole thing of only God can judge, the idea of that is that we do not know enough of cause and effect and of history and of the interplay of everything that is to make a correct judgment, and yet we do make judgments, and so many of the things that we do that are despicable are based upon judgments. Love thy neighbor is not judge thy neighbor. The Garden of Eden is the place where Adam and Eve, what's the word? You don't have to believe in this. Your belief doesn't matter. Lean into the story to understand the meaning. It's the place where right and wrong didn't exist. It's the field beyond right doing and wrong doing that Rumi spoke about. That's the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve walked about naked and it was plentiful. And then they ate from the tree. They ate of the apple from the tree that the serpent was in. Temptation. And that temptation was to know. Knowing is not the same thing as embodying. Knowing is not the same thing as being. Knowing means to understand, which is to sort of stand under the actual thing. It's to look at, it's to become, it's to refer to oneself. To refer to oneself, which is not the same thing as to embody oneself. It's to think of oneself rather than to embody oneself. So you eat from the tree, you become self-aware. But you do not become self-aware in the helpful way which helps you to harmoniously interact with that which is around you. You become self-aware in the way which allows you to doubt and to question that which is, and to question yourself. And they covered their naked bodies with leaves. They covered their genitals with leaves because they were ashamed. They were ashamed. And God said, "Why have you covered your bodies? Who told you to be ashamed?" God didn't tell us to be ashamed. God wouldn't tell the lion to be ashamed of eating the gazelle. This is a psycho-emotional issue. This is the virus, so to speak, of the mind. This is the inversion. This is sin. The sin is to misunderstand the word of God. The word of God is silent and all-pervasive, and the sin is to think that you understand it without being able to embody and interact with life harmoniously, as if There are no others. So, God says, you know nothing. Life says, you know nothing. Love says, you know nothing. And in giving up what you know, in surrendering and unknowing that which you are interacting with, the new emerges, because there is space for the new to emerge when the judgment of the past is not projected onto the present. This frees us from psycho-emotional suffering and creates the unification of spirit and matter. Spirit and matter are one. Spirit and matter are one. The dirt is the gold, the body is the heart. Its spirit is all through matter, and matter is all through spirit, and they move effortlessly, they slide against each other, they pass through each other. There is no friction between spirit and matter. All of the friction occurs in the mind, thinking that we understand what we should judge and what we should not, and most often we invert that understanding, and most of what you see in common sense and common behavior and the things which people fear are inverted. And in this little book that I have, The Way of the Buddha, there's an excerpt that says, we fear that which we should not, and we do not fear that which we should. It's the inversion. It's thinking we know, and it's doubting the body. It's doubting matter. It's doubting the spirit within the matter. It's doubting the fullness of the most basic. It's doubting the gold in the mud, the lotus that grows from the mud. It's thinking this grandiosity and then this shame that we shouldn't be what we are, that we shouldn't run and relate and express naked in the Garden of Eden. It's thinking that we did something wrong. And the thought that you've done something wrong is not the same, that blame is not the same as learning through observing what is, and then allowing your learned self to act differently naturally. And that is the devil, so to speak. I hope you found this video interesting. Maybe you can make some connections here. Maybe this is valuable for you. I don't have all the answers, and embodying and living this is its own practice. But I do believe that Tai Chi, Qigong, yoga to an extent, and practices which work with neurology and the operating system of the body, strengthening the foundations, the sinews. Neuro is defined as like nerve or sinew, so the tendons, it's like the electrical impulses that pass through, strengthening our internal capacity helps us to be, practically speaking, more loving in a situation where the external can't be controlled. And yes, the body will deteriorate, and yes, we may lose our faculties and we may regress, but with constant practice, we're less likely to regress as far. And we're more likely in our lifetime to pass on healthier relating patterns in more and more of our interactions, to the extent that our impact upon this world is one of harmony, which is kind of the opposite of impact, actually. Ego wants to make impact. Soul wants to harmonize. So it's by going through this process that we can love under more variable and volatile conditions. We can take on more of what has caused the suffering without taking on the suffering. It's less codependent, it's more interdependent. Much love.